Hello everyone. I am really happy to be able to participate in this conference, and I am really looking forward to interesting discussions. My presentation will be a very general overview of ways in which we can use networks to study the transmission of medieval texts. In the first place, I need to say a few words about medieval manuscripts and textual compilations. The fact that compilations were common in the days before the widespread implementation of the printing press is not surprising. Manuscripts are highly customizable, as each object is produced individually, and the codex format makes compilation very straightforward. You can add as many booklets as you want, and the navigation of the text remains relatively easy. In the European Middle Ages, we find very different kinds of textual compilations. On the one extreme of the spectrum, there are dissimilar groups of texts, sometimes originally independent booklets, that have been bound together in a bigger codex. On the other side of the spectrum, we see collections that have been planned as such from the start, that might even include a table of content. The result of this practice is what I call shared manuscript transmission. The fact that some texts share one or more manuscripts, where they are copied together. Shared manuscript transmission is very relevant to understand the life of medieval literature, the reception and dissemination of medieval texts. There are many ways to study shared manuscript transmission. Today, I will present a method that uses the advantages of available online databases, statistics, and network analysis tools. The main idea behind it is that we can create a network model in order to explore, analyze the texts and manuscripts from the Middle Ages. I will not dig deep into any specific research question. Instead, I will show an overview of possible methods and strategies of analysis. Let me show you a simple example of what I mean before going into more detail. The following visualizations were created using Neo4j, a graph database. We can start with a single text, represented as a node. In this case, this is Don Juan Manuel's El Conde Lucanor. This text is itself a collection of short stories in prose, which also includes some small poetic forms. But let's consider it as a unit for now. We can represent the text being attested in manuscripts as a small network, where the manuscripts are connected to the work they contain. We can then expand the network as we show other texts that those same manuscripts contain. As we increase the network, we start seeing more interconnections, as other works are copied in the manuscript already visible in the network. We finally arrive at the point where all the immediate shared manuscripts of El Conde Lucanor are visible, and we could keep expanding from this point. Using queries in Neo4j's query language, Cypher, we do not have to manually expand or contract the network. We can, for example, ask to directly retrieve all the works by Don Juan Manuel, like in this example. However, this exploratory analysis of such a network is only one of the possibilities, and I will be demonstrating many more in this presentation. But first, I would like to talk about the database used in my research. I used 3 online databases of texts in vernacular languages: Handschriftencensus for German, Jonas for French, and Philobibion for Spanish. They are similar, but have important differences. Many of these differences reflect differences in the sources, but many are due to differences in how each database compiles the materials, the philological tradition they are based upon, as well as their particular goals and even funding. That's why it is not always easy to know if some features we encounter in our analysis reflect historical circumstances in the medieval period, what happened to the documents in more recent times, or the way that databases were constructed. When we study this data, we are studying not only the medieval times, but also the databases themselves. The first database in alphabetical order is Handschriftencensus. It started in 2006, but only recently became part of the Academy for Science and Literature in Mainz. It works with low granularity, which means that short genres like lyrical poetry or recipes are not identified as units. Jonas, the database for French language, has a long prehistory, which started in the 1940s, but the digital project only begins in 2002. It includes text in both Languedoc and Languedoc, and sometimes even other languages. It works with a pretty good level of granularity. For example, lyrical poems are identified individually. Finally, Philobibion goes back to the 1970s, already using computers back then. It's a collaboration of many institutions and individuals, and is hosted at the Bancroft Library in Berkeley. And it covers all Iberian languages. Although for this presentation I will only deal with Spanish texts. From the three, it is the most exhaustive for the textual production in a language and identifies works with a good level of granularity. While all three databases are amazing and provide a great resource for scholars, they were not created for the kind of research I use here. Especially problematic is that the quality of the entries varies widely. Some manuscripts and texts are exhaustively described, while many others are incomplete, and this can lead to false results. I use these databases because they provide an amount of information which could be very hard to assemble otherwise. But we have to be aware that the data was not created with statistical analysis in mind, but for human consultation. I want to focus on how thinking about manuscript transmission as a network can assist in our research. I will not go into detail into any particular issue, but I will show some possible paths one might take. For example, we could ask if authorship was a criterion when compiling text. In other words, whether scribes were purposefully looking for texts of the same author to create coherent collections. Some statistical analysis of the data can offer some insight into this question. In this table, we see, in the first place, the collections in each dataset. Collections are manuscripts with more than one text. This number is probably lower than it should be because of incomplete entries in the sources. But in any case, we can then ask how many of those collections have at least one text with a known author. And we find a very clear difference between Spanish on the one side and French and German on the other. 95% of collections in Philobibion have at least one non-anonymous text, while only 65% in the other languages. The next question we can ask is how many of those collections with at least one non-anonymous text actually are collections that only contain text by one author. So authorial, single author collections. This is extremely rare in German, only 14%, more common in French, 35%, and quite common in Spanish, 47%. So this means that more than 40% of all the collections in Spanish literature recorded in Philobibion are actually collections dedicated to a single author. From this data, we can clearly see that the question about authorship and creation of collections is specific to each context. Using networks as a framework, we can start abstracting the data and asking some other questions. For example, we can transform our original two-mode network into a one-mode network. This means instead of having a network with two different kinds of nodes, so manuscripts and texts, we only keep one kind of nodes, in our case, text. Let's suppose we have a small sample where one manuscript contains two works. We can create a connection between those works, stating that they have a shared transmission, that is, that they appear together in at least one manuscript. To create the one-mode network, we then erase all the manuscript nodes and only keep the text with their new connection. Here we see the result of creating this new kind of network for each of the complete datasets. In all of them, we identify a similar structure. A giant component with a great number of interconnected texts, which I call the continent here in blue. Then some small components separated from the main one, which I call archipelagos, so a small group of interconnected texts but separated from the rest, here in red color. And finally, text without connections, islands, which are in the outer layer in violet. We encounter the same topography in all three networks, but in different proportions. But in all the cases, we see continent, what is sometimes also known as the giant component, and then comparably a small number of archipelagos and islands. We can test the robustness of the giant component by removing nodes. If each time we remove one node, the component only loses that one node, then the network is perfectly robust. We see this in the green straight line. However, that doesn't happen in many real networks. Here we can test the robustness with two different methods. By removing a random node, which I did here in the blue line, or by removing the node with the most connections. This is the yellow line, and this is also known as an attack. We can use the attacks to find key nodes in the component whose removal would collapse the network. I will not go into detail, but both in Philobiblon and Jonas, we see that some removals have a huge effect. In Jonas, most of the works with the highest degree are poetical works. When reaching the 27th attack, the connections of the poetry cluster with the giant component are destroyed, and we can identify which are these key poetical texts. In Philobiblon, we find in the first position an artifact of the database. The entry recipes is not an actual text, but a placeholder for unidentified recipes. When it is removed, many identified recipes lose their connection with the continent and create their own archipelago. We can also see that the texts with the highest degrees in Philobiblon are mostly medical and to a lesser degree hagiographical texts, and that there is one Aristotelian text, the Ejemplario de Aristóteles, which clearly ties together different parts of the network, and its removal causes 254 texts to disconnect. Let's go back to the question of finding patterns in the transmission. We might try to see the effect of some features that intuitively seem relevant, such as the form, prose, or verse. We have this information in Jonas and Philobiblon. The first thing we should notice is that the proportion of prose and verse is very different in each collection. Jonas has a mostly equivalent number of prose and verse, while in Philobiblon prose dominates. However, we see that the number of edges between texts of the same form is very high in both cases, that most connections happen between two nodes in the same form. We can see this correlation more graphically in the network, in this case the continent of Jonas, which contains most of the nodes. We can appreciate that prose and verse constitute different clusters, and most connections happen within each group, with some, not so few, central nodes enabling the linking of both groups. To get a more precise understanding of how significant this correlation is, we can perform a small experiment. We can assume that if the form of the text could be meaningless when creating a compilation, we should be able to distribute the feature prose or verse randomly among our nodes and get similar results to the actual data. In other words, we shuffle the attributes form, prose or verse in the nodes, and we check if we still find that edges connect mostly texts of the same form or not. That is clearly not the case. Here we plot the actual data value that in both cases is around 95% and compare it with the result of the shuffle experiments. I performed the random shuffle 100 different times for each collection so that I get a different number of values in each try. And however, all the results of those experiments are in a very small range, about 70% on Philobiblon and around 50% for Jonas. This makes sense when we consider that the amount of prose or verse in each of the collections is very different. Of course, what is missing in this data is a more nuanced description of the mixing of prose and verse, as many works contain both in different proportions and configurations, like we see in this fragment of El Conde Lucanor, in a text that is mostly a collection of short stories in prose, but where each of these stories has attached a short poem at the end. This kind of nuance is missing in the databases that usually only note the main form. We don't have to always work on that general level, and it's interesting to investigate a smaller subcorpora. In fact, due to the incompleteness and biases of datasets, it may be useful to just focus on small groups, for which we have more reliable and complete information. For example, we can study the German log narrative poetry, the epic in a very wide sense. In this network, we see the manually tagged corpus in blue in their immediate context in the complete network. We can appreciate that there are more connections from this group to the other texts than there are within the group. Exceptions are some unusually strong connections among members of the group. A completely different behavior can be observed in the corpus of French saints' life. This corpus was created by Jonas between 2005 and 2010 and has 3,500 texts. So it's a much larger corpus than in the previous example. This is still a much more coherent and homogeneous group. There are more connections within the groups as outside the group. We also see very different clusters of texts that are transmitted together. So the geographical collections constitute a group of texts that tend to appear as such and not get as easily dispersed or separated as the German epic. Finally, a much smaller corpus, the Mester de Clerecia. This is not really a homogeneous material. It is the name given to a group of texts composed in a particular form known as Quaderna Via, mostly in the second half of the 13th century. They clearly do not create a group when we consider their manuscript transmission. They are grouped with other texts by criteria that have nothing to do with all of them being part of the Mester de Clerecia. The only apparent exceptions are the texts of Gonzalo de Berceo, here in the middle. However, it is clear that the relevant fact there is that they are all texts composed by the same author. In these examples, we can appreciate how texts in different traditions and genres behave also in different ways when we consider the shared manuscript transmission. Some genres tend to create collections that are usually transmitted together, while others are clearly more open. We can also subdivide the group into smaller communities to study some other properties. For example, in the German narrative, we can also group the text by the subgenre. Then we can merge all the texts of the same genre in one node. The resulting network shows the connections inside and between genres. We see that some genres have clearly stronger links than others. The corpus of French hagiography created by Jonas is a great source to study, as we know that all relevant manuscripts have been catalogued exhaustively and completely, and they have a lot of relevant information. For example, we can see the behavior of different language in the text of the corpus. There is a separated component of text in Languedoc, while most of the notes are composed in Languedoc, and they are connected to small clusters in other languages. We can use the same corpus to explore some centrality measurements. Simplifying the issue, this centrality measurement used here evaluates how important a node is for the connectivity of the network by seeing not only how well connected it is, but also how well connected its neighbors are. So for example, in this case, we see clearly one very important node here and varying degrees of centrality in other places. One might think that there should be a correlation between the number of manuscripts and the centrality of a node, and that would make sense, because the more witnesses a text has, the easier it should be for it to have relevant connections. And this is true to some degree. However, it's also more complex. Here we see a table of the text with the highest number of witnesses and a table of the text with the highest centrality. Only one text among the first 8 is common, the life of Saint Catherine. However, the text with the by far most highest amount of manuscripts, the life of Saint Margaret, has a very low centrality. On the other hand, a text with relatively few manuscripts, the life of Saint Nicaise and his sister Europ, has the highest centrality overall. We can compare the immediate networks of those texts to better understand what is going on. The Saint Margaret life has many witnesses, but in most of them it is alone, even though it is a relatively short text. Here we only see those manuscripts where other saints' lives are present. However, the other life, although it has only a few witnesses, each of those are very large connections. Of course, here we're only considering the connections within the French hagiography. It is possible that the life of Saint Margaret has interesting connections with texts in other groups, so that it's a text that has found a way to mingle with other genres. But in any case, the realization that the number of witnesses of a text and the centrality for shared manuscript transmission do not absolutely correlate could be an interesting factor or starting point of a research of the manuscript transmission of this corpus of French hagiography. In this presentation, I have not tried to defend any hypothesis. I just wanted to show the possibilities of network analysis of shared manuscript transmission on a relatively large corpus of medieval literature. I think network analysis can be a very useful auxiliary method when doing research on medieval manuscripts and texts. I don't think it's likely it can by itself create big discoveries, but can be extremely instrumental in answering many research questions. On the other hand, the reuse of available online databases allows to do some research without gathering our own data, but it has clear limitations. The datasets have many different biases. They are incomplete and selective, but not necessarily representative, what can create erroneous results. So what I mean is that when working with such databases, we should take the results with a huge grain of salt. Very clear patterns and correlations are probably still valid, like the correlation between prose and verse. But in many cases, it might be more useful to work with a restricted but higher quality subcorpus. I hope no one understands these remarks as a critique of the 3 databases used in this presentation. On the contrary, they are amazing projects that have already provided a great instrument for research, and I am sure that in the future they will keep improving and enable new and exciting research. So, thank you very much.